Hey y'all, Dave here. This video was inspired by a post I came across on Twitter not so long ago. The tweet was from the account Beat the Cult, and in it she asked the question, is atheism the only intellectually honest answer to the question, does God exist? As always, her tweet generated plenty of discussion, some of which I got involved with. But Twitter is a limited format and couldn't really do the question justice. So I decided to make a video answering the question in more detail and discussing intellectual honesty and how it relates to atheism and other positions. So, like I mentioned in the preamble, a little while ago I came across an interesting question on Twitter. The question asked if atheism is the only intellectually honest answer to the question, does God exist? As always, when it comes to atheists in the atheist community, there was quite a wide variety of answers and discussions going on in response to the question. My own response was that atheism is not the only intellectually honest answer to that question. And I also stated that theism too can be an intellectually honest answer to the question, does God exist? I was pleasantly surprised by how few angry responses I got to that answer. That's not to say I got no answers though. My answer did generate some very enjoyable discussions, with some of those conversations still going on a couple of days later. Like I said, the question itself is an interesting one, and a larger one than many might expect, at least if you really want to do the question justice and give it a fair answer. Something that Twitter makes hard to do. As usual, I thought I would make a video on the topic, as that allows me to go into details that Twitter certainly does not and cannot allow, and details that some skeptics and atheists may not think about. To quote a complaint someone made about me recently, there's nothing so simple that a philosopher can't overcomplicate. So this video will overcomplicate the question by looking at various definitions of atheism, what it means to be intellectually honest, and whether other positions beside atheism could be considered intellectually honest. Let's begin by looking at some common definitions of atheism. Okay, so here's the first part where there will probably be some slightly pissed off atheists. If you're one of those atheists, then don't take to the comments section angrily telling me that there's only one definition of atheism just yet. Before doing that, check out my video, Atheism, A Tale of Two Usages. A title card for that should be appearing on screen somewhere right about now. If after watching that you still feel the need to tell me I'm wrong, then knock yourself out. But be warned, you better have a strong argument, and one that I haven't already covered in that video. For the rest of us, let's carry on. If we were to list all the various definitions of atheism that are in play, we would be making a 20-part series. There are a huge number of idiosyncratic definitions out there, with lots of individuals defining it in very personal ways. So instead, what we'll focus on is a few of the bigger and more widely used definitions and usages. These are atheism as the belief God does not exist, atheism as a lack of belief in God, atheism as the proposition God does not exist, and we'll look at the popular agnostic, gnostic distinctions for atheism. As stated, these definitions are the bigger and more widely used definitions. They are described in various ways, like strong and weak atheism, hard and soft atheism, philosophical atheism, and that kind of thing. So rather than focusing on the descriptor, I'll focus on the positions themselves. That way the terms won't get in the way of the argument. We'll also be looking at other positions like agnosticism and ichtheism, agnosticism, and theism itself later on. Looking at the position and comparing them to the criteria for what it means for a position or belief to be intellectually honest. Which means that we must first look at intellectual honesty. So what does it mean to be intellectually honest? As stated by T. Ryan Byerly in his paper Intellectual Honesty and Intellectual Transparency, intellectual honesty is an intellectual virtue. It exists alongside other intellectual virtues such as intellectual attentiveness, intellectual carefulness, intellectual perseverance, intellectual courage, intellectual fair-mindedness, and intellectual charity. We must put all of these things into practice in order to be good critical thinkers, and we cannot drop any of these without also compromising our intellectual honesty. Philosopher Christian B. Miller describes intellectual honesty as the virtue of being disposed, centrally and reliably, to not distort the facts as the agent sees them, in his 2021 book, Honesty, the Philosophy and Psychology of a Neglected Virtue. To put this in simpler language, a big part of intellectual honesty is to represent the facts as you see them in an honest way. For an easy example here, let's use Alex Jones's recent court case. It is well known that for many years, Alex Jones has presented the Sandy Hook shootings as a false flag. Jones claimed that there were actually no children killed and that all of the parents and children were just crisis actors playing a role. This is a very reductive description, of course, but one that is true nonetheless. So the question here becomes, was Jones being intellectually honest when promoting these claims? Well, according to Jones's lawyer during his divorce case, Jones is simply playing a character and it is a performance artist. As his lawyer stated at the time, to judge Jones by his InfoWars performances would be like judging Jack Nicholson by his depiction of the Joker on The Batman. This doesn't necessarily mean that Jones does not believe the things he was promoting about Sandy Hook, of course. He was in a court case and he was trying to win. However, it can be looked at as such. If Jones's admission that he's simply playing a character is true, then he was not being intellectually honest about the claims he made about Sandy Hook. He was not representing the facts as he saw them. He was representing the facts in the form of a conspiracy-driven character, and in a way that would appeal to other conspiracy-driven people. He was being dishonest in his representation of how he sees the facts, and representing them as though they were how he sees them. He was knowingly lying and knowingly being dishonest. He was, for all intents and purposes, being intellectually dishonest. Now, if it was to be argued here that he wasn't being intellectually dishonest when promoting these conspiracies on his show, then that doesn't help to salvage Jones's intellectual honesty, as it means that he was being intellectually dishonest in the court case, as well as just plain dishonest too, of course. After all, he was misrepresenting the facts as he saw them. He was presenting the facts as though he didn't believe them, and was just being a performance artist, when actually on his show he was presenting the facts as he saw them, making him intellectually dishonest when he claims to just be a performance artist. Whichever way we look at it, Jones was being intellectually dishonest. I mean, come on, let's face it, it's Alex Jones. But what of his fans, though? What of all those fans who took what Jones said and took it on board as if Jones was promoting the facts? That could be considered a very different matter. After all, many of Jones's fans took his representation of the facts as, well, factual. He presented them as if they were facts. Jones even went so far as to present evidence that he claimed proved his representation of the facts. His fans also believed that Jones was being intellectually honest. Jones's fans believed that Jones was the only person willing to stand up and tell the truth in a sea of lies. They were, for all intents and purposes, fooled by Jones's intellectual dishonesty. Those fans then went on to spread Jones's falsehoods as if they were honest representations of the facts. They in turn believed they were honestly representing the facts, and they were honestly representing their beliefs about the facts. That they were mistaken and hoodwinked by a con man calling himself a performance artist is a different matter to their being intellectually honest, according to the account from Miller at least. This is not to say that all fans of Jones were being intellectually honest. There would be those that were simply spreading what they knew to be falsehoods and propaganda. This much seems pretty obvious. However, to claim that they were all lying would be an overreach from those making that claim. To quote Byerly here, when people lie, they intend to get other people to believe claim P that they themselves think is false by asserting P. And deception more broadly involves trying to get people to believe a claim P when one does not believe P or believes P to be false, though it needn't involve asserting P. So in the case where Jones's fans believed Jones's claims and went on to spread them, we can see they weren't lying or attempting to deceive people. They were being honest about what they believed were the facts. Being dishonest involves deliberately misrepresenting things that one takes to be another way. So there seems to be a relevant distinction here between one who knowingly misrepresents facts and argues for things they believe to be false, and the one who believes false things but argues for them because they believe them to be true. In the case of the former, we are seeing obvious intellectual dishonesty, and, well, just plain dishonesty. In the case of the latter, we may not necessarily be seeing intellectual dishonesty. One other simple way to look at it is the idea that an intellectually honest person is a person whose intent is to avoid leading others to believe things that the intellectually honest person believes are false. Up to now, we've looked at intellectual honesty simply in terms of expressing our beliefs and how we see certain facts. However, that's just one element of intellectual honesty. As you might suspect, there is more to it than simply being honest about our beliefs and honest about how we see facts. One way we can look at what we've seen so far is that intellectual honesty is based on a motivation and desire to not deceive others. In other words, truth is an important motivating factor behind being intellectually honest. This means that truth and the desire to spread truth is an important factor when it comes to intellectual honesty. So far, we've looked at it in the sense of an outward motivation, the motivation to not spread falsehoods. From this, we can see that there should be an additional inward motivation. That motivation being the desire to not only spread truth, but to hold truth and to get to the truth. For if we care about not spreading falsehoods, then we ought to care about whether the information we hold is not a falsehood. The desire to not deceive other people should lead to us having a desire to not deceive ourselves. In other words, intellectual honesty is something that is inwardly motivated as well as outwardly motivated. With this taken into account, we can see that those Alex Jones fans were not doing their due diligence after getting that information from Jones. They simply lapped it up and unquestioningly accepted it. They also ignored other facts that clearly countered the narrative that Jones presented, as they preferred a distorted narrative that fit their worldview, their bigotries, and the like. In other words, they lost any claim they might have had to intellectual honesty because their motivations were based on something other than ensuring they had and spread the truth. They preferred a narrative to the truth. The desire to not distort facts when spreading information to other people should drive an inward desire to not distort facts to ourselves. For if we distort facts to ourselves, then we are not fulfilling our desire to not distort facts to others. Our motivation to spread truth to others should motivate us to make sure we are holding the truth to begin with. It should drive us to carefully consider facts, rather than just simply accepting those facts because they feel right to us. Which is where the intellectual virtues mentioned earlier in the video come in, as well as the intellectual virtue of skepticism. If we care about truth and care about not spreading falsehoods, then we ought to care about those other intellectual virtues also. It would take us a lot longer to go through all the finer details of intellectual honesty. In fact, it would probably take a whole series of videos to go through those finer details. If you want that, then I'd certainly be happy to work on a series of videos discussing it. That's not the point of this video though. The point of this video is to look at the question of whether atheism is the only intellectual honest answer to the question of God's existence. So, this understanding of the basics of what it means to be intellectually honest is sufficient for that purpose. If there is any nuance that needs expanding on in the moment, then I can do that when it's necessary. For the purposes of this video though, we'll be going with a summary based on what was already mentioned. That intellectual honesty is the desire to be truthful to ourselves and to others, and to be motivated by the desire to spread truth, which includes not being deceitful when promoting our beliefs, and to accurately represent what we believe, to put it in a rough manner anyway. So is atheism the only position that does this when it comes to responding to the question of God's existence? Let's start by taking a look at atheism in the sense of the popular lack of belief in gods first. First, let's look at it simply as a direct response to the question, does God exist? If I was to ask someone, does God exist? And they responded with, I lack belief in God, is that an intellectually honest answer? Well, as stated previously, one of the criteria for intellectual honesty is that the agent is not misrepresenting the facts as they see them when giving information to another party. In this case, if the agent truly does only lack a belief in God, and responds that they lack a belief in God, then this appears to be an intellectually honest answer to the question, does God exist? The agent is honestly describing that they lack a belief in God. There's something to note here, though. While it may be an intellectually honest answer in that they are honestly describing the facts as they see them about their belief in God, they are not actually answering the question. They are instead answering a different question. What they are answering is the question, do you believe in God? Which is an entirely different question. So with this in mind, we would have to change our answer here. Atheism, in the sense of lack of belief in God, is not even an answer to the question, does God exist? Meaning that as an answer to the question, does God exist, it cannot be an intellectually honest answer, as they are not honestly describing the facts of the matter as they see them when it comes to God's existence. You could derive from their answer that they lack a belief in God that they do not answer yes to the question, does God exist? However, as many conversations with this kind of atheist will reveal, saying that you do not believe it true does not mean you believe it false. This means that we do not know from the answer whether they believe it false or whether they simply do not believe it, which explains why it's not an intellectually honest answer to the question, and why it does not necessarily represent the facts as the agent sees them with regard to this question. There is something important to mention here, though. This form of atheism is not meant to answer the question, does God exist? It is instead meant to answer the question, do you believe God exists? They see atheism and theism as a dichotomy addressing belief in God, with theism describing those that believe in God, and atheism describing those who do not believe in God, or to state the obvious, those that lack belief in gods. So one could argue here that it is something of an error to apply this form of atheism to the question, does God exist, as it's not meant to address this question. However, what's being asked here is whether or not atheism is an intellectually honest answer to the question, does God exist? To which it could only be concluded that no, this form of atheism is not an intellectually honest answer to that question. It should always be remembered, though, that it is not meant to be an intellectually honest answer to that question. The atheist that has adopted this form of atheism may have a different answer to that question. As an answer to the question, do you believe in God, though? It is an intellectually honest answer. So this is where our exploration of atheism and intellectual honesty gets a little controversial again for some atheists, as it discusses atheism as the belief God does not exist. For those that want to argue that this is not a definition of atheism, or that there is only one definition of atheism, I refer you to the introduction of the video again. Go watch Atheism: A Tale of Two Usages, and then get back to me. For the rest of us, let's continue. Is this form of atheism an intellectually honest answer to the question, does God exist? The questions here are the same as the previous section. Does atheism in this form honestly describe the facts as the agent sees them? Well, if the agent honestly believes that God does not exist, then, as with the previous section, it certainly does honestly represent the fact of their belief state. So it seems to be an intellectually honest answer to the question, do you believe God exists? However, is it also an intellectually honest answer to the question, does God exist? Well, it seems to be. If one was to be asked, does God exist, and was to respond with, I believe God does not exist, the question is answered. It clearly answers that they believe that God does not exist, making it a direct and unambiguous answer to the question, that answer being no. I think it is the case that God does not exist. It tells us that the respondent thinks that all the facts as they see them about God and about the universe point towards the conclusion that God does not exist. So, as long as the agent honestly believes the universe is godless and is representing the facts as he sees them honestly, then the agent is being intellectually honest. Of course, we have to remember the caveats such as whether the belief was formed honestly and was formed based on honest representations of the arguments for God's existence, and that the agent has at least done what they can to explore those arguments. But so long as those things are met, and so long as the atheist is being honest about their views, then this form of atheism is an intellectually honest answer to the question, does God exist? As mentioned at the beginning of the video, along with the previous two definitions discussed, there are a couple more. There is atheism as the proposition God does not exist, and the Gnostic-Agnostic distinctions of atheism. Thankfully, we don't have to go into too much detail here. If we think about the Gnostic-Agnostic distinctions of atheism, both of those are already represented by the lack of belief in God's definition. The Gnostic-Agnostic distinctions don't actually change that part, as they are most commonly used to refer to the idea of whether the atheist claims to know or claims not to know whether God exists. So it remains the same as the argument presented about the lack of belief in God's definition. Something similar could be said for the idea of atheism as the proposition God does not exist. This follows the same argument and reasoning with regards to intellectual honesty as atheism as the belief God does not exist. Though often when it comes to atheism as the proposition God does not exist, the term atheist is used to describe the agent that believes atheism. So responding with, I'm an atheist, to the question, do you believe God exists, fulfills the same purpose. Meaning that we do not need to run extra arguments for these positions in order to determine whether they are intellectually honest answers to the question, does God exist? We've now assessed whether atheism is an intellectually honest answer to that question. But that's not where our assessment ends. The question asked was not, is atheism an intellectually honest answer to the question, does God exist? The question asked was whether it was the only intellectually honest answer to the question. This means that we still have a few positions left to assess. Let's start with agnosticism. There are several different ways the term agnostic is used. We've already seen one, its use as a knowledge modifier for the lack of belief form of atheism. However, that usage is irrelevant here as it is not a standalone position. What we'll focus on here are agnosticism in the form that was put forward by T.H. Huxley, as well as the idea of an agnostic being someone that is simply in a psychological state of uncertainty. Let's begin with the latter. The psychological form of agnostic is, to put it simply, being undecided on whether or not God exists. The agnostic in this sense neither affirms the position that God does not exist, nor affirms the position that God does exist. They are unconvinced by the arguments made from either camp and are therefore undecided on the matter. This does not necessarily mean that they sit smack dab in the middle, sitting at 50% for either side, as some mistakenly believe. The agnostic in this sense might lean more one way than the other. It's just that neither side is compelling enough for them to feel warranted in affirming either position. So, can this form of agnostic be an intellectually honest answer to the question, does God exist? As with the lack of belief in God style atheism, it too is a report of a psychological state. However, unlike with the lack of belief in God style atheism, it gives a response to both the yes and no side of the question. The agnostic in this sense lacks a belief in God's existing, as well as lacks a belief in God's not existing. When the agnostic in this sense states that they are agnostic, they are, for all intents and purposes, saying, I'm not saying yes and I'm not saying no. I'm not convinced of either. So this form of agnosticism is giving a direct answer to the question, does God exist? Which means that as long as they are not misrepresenting the facts as they see them, it is an intellectually honest answer to the question, does God exist? What about the other form of agnostic though? Well, it might be tempting to argue here that these are the same positions, as neither form of agnostic affirms a yes or no answer, there are major differences between the two. The agnostic in this sense does not affirm a yes or no answer because they believe that both sides overstate their case. They believe the atheist and theist make conclusions and form beliefs and claim knowledge beyond what the evidence and arguments allow for. The agnostic in this sense argues that we should not believe or claim to know that for which there is not sufficient evidence to support it, with sufficient evidence in this case referring to scientific evidence. This means that we can clearly see that the agnostic in this sense is giving a direct answer to the question, does God exist? They are stating that both sides overstate their case and there is not sufficient justification for either side. It's not just a suspension of belief, as was the previous form of agnostic. Instead, it is a dismissal of both claims as unjustified. There is also the inclusion of an epistemic principle, one that could be considered a form of intellectual honesty when it comes to belief formation. It is an epistemic principle designed at getting at truth. So the agnostic in this sense is giving an intellectually honest answer to the question, does God exist? As well as running off of a principle designed to keep intellectually honest. It is an epistemic principle that promotes a form of skepticism, as well as promoting the same kind of idea that Hume promotes when he argues that we should proportion our beliefs to the evidence. As agnostic in both of these senses could be considered to be an intellectually honest answer to the question, does God exist? This means that atheism is not the only intellectually honest answer to said question. It's interesting to note here that agnostics in the sense of Huxley and agnosticism might accuse atheists of being intellectually dishonest, as agnostics in that sense may accuse the atheist of overreaching when representing the facts, and we'll sort of touch on this a little later. With that stated, and it shown that atheism is not the only intellectually honest answer to the question of God's existence, there are still several positions that can be covered. However, I won't be running through these in the same way I did the others. The point has already been made that atheism is not the only intellectually honest position. What I'm about to say may induce some protest and outrage in some atheists, though. All of those remaining positions, including theism, could be considered intellectually honest positions depending on who is holding them. I know, it seems strange to say that theism can be an intellectually honest position, doesn't it? Especially coming from someone that not only is an atheist, but also believes that God does not exist. And as many atheists argue, it's irrational to believe in things that don't exist, and it's intellectually dishonest to believe in things that don't exist. The problem with these claims should be apparent by now, though. It's not the position itself that is intellectually dishonest. Just as with the rationality of a position, the intellectual honesty of a position depends on how the belief was formed. Was the belief formed in a way that does not misrepresent the facts? And does the belief honestly represent the facts? These are the important questions to ask when it comes to whether or not the agent's position is an intellectually honest one. There is more to it, of course, and it can be a complicated matter discovering whether or not the beliefs are intellectually honest. But it is not the position itself that makes someone intellectually dishonest. It is possible to come to the position of atheism in an intellectually dishonest way. Bad reasoning, dishonest representations of theist argument, misrepresenting what you actually believe about God's existence, they're all possible for the atheist, giving us more indication that atheism is not the only intellectually honest answer to the question, does God exist? As sometimes that might not even be an intellectually honest answer for some atheists. Just as with anything in life, it's a complicated matter, and most certainly more complicated than saying if you believe such and such, then you are intellectually dishonest. The idea of intellectual honesty, including what it is, when we have it, the best way to approach it, etc., is obviously a very big topic. And there is a lot of works out there discussing it. We've already discussed quite a lot and barely scratched the surface. In the beginning of the video, we looked at a very simplistic account of what it is from people like Miller and Byerly. From their accounts, we can see that, much like rationality, intellectual honesty isn't just about what we believe. It is also about why we believe it and how we came to form those beliefs. It is also about honesty in expressing those beliefs to other people, along with having a concern for both acquiring and spreading the truth. We also took a look at the question of intellectual honesty when it comes to atheism and the various definitions of atheism, by comparing those definitions as answers to the question, does God exist, as was asked by the original tweeter. From those comparisons, we could see that the lack of belief in God's definition could be seen as something of an intellectually dishonest answer to that particular question, while also acknowledging that those that use that definition don't usually consider it an answer to the question, does God exist? Instead, they see it as an answer to the question, do you believe God exists? Once again, giving us some indication that intellectual honesty is more than just the positions that we hold. It is also about being honest about what we believe and giving honest answers to questions, which is why we also took a look at a couple of kinds of agnostic, as the agnostic position is also one that can be taken with regards to the question, does God exist? Having looked at both the psychological state version of agnostic and the Huxleyan version of agnostic, we saw that both of those are intellectually honest positions when it comes to the question, does God exist? Meaning that a claim like atheism is the only intellectually honest position in response to the question, does God exist, is a false one. Not only is it not the only intellectually honest position, sometimes atheism isn't even an intellectually honest position when it comes to that question. Something I mentioned during that section was about how there are agnostics that argue that agnosticism is the only intellectually honest position when it comes to the question of God's existence. When it comes to this claim, the response is little different to the response to an atheist making the same claim. It just isn't the only intellectually honest response to the question of God's existence. Another point that was also raised was that even a position like theism could be considered an intellectually honest response to the question of God's existence. This is because, as stated previously, it is about belief formation and attitudes, not just about the conclusion. So as long as the theist has formed their beliefs in an honest manner and examined the counterclaims in an honest way and to the best of their ability, then those beliefs could be considered to have been formed in an intellectually honest way. It seems like a pretty uncontroversial thing to say as far as I'm concerned, and should be uncontroversial to anyone that understands how rationality and intellectual honesty work. This shouldn't be taken as me saying that all theists are intellectually honest in their position. Each agent and each position should be judged on a case-by-case basis. Anyway, I know I said I was going to try to keep the length of my videos down, but this one is a much larger topic than a 10 or 15-minute video would do justice to. I can also imagine that there will be plenty of angry comments from atheists arguing about how theists can never be intellectually honest, or that theism can never be an intellectually honest position, or that I have misrepresented atheism in some way here. The best I can recommend here is to do some research on what intellectual honesty is in the case of the former, and the video Atheism: A Tale of Two Usages in the case of the latter. Hopefully, though, it will at least give some food for thought when it comes to the topic of intellectual honesty, and maybe even give a few people thoughts of questioning their own intellectual honesty. For now, though, I'll end the video. See you in the next one. Take care, everyone. Bye.